Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. No poder criativo que nasce dos palcos, orquestras, das artes, das ruas e dos museus. Na valorização das diversas identidades brasileiras e na preservação de memórias. É valorizando a cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 22ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei Federal de Incentivo à Cultura, PRONAC 235060, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiências física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú, CCR e Suzano. Patrocínio Prata, MAC Móveis, Eletronuclear, O Globo e Sesc. Patrocínio Bronze, Sebrae e Globo Livros. Parceria institucional, Prefeitura de Paraty, Secretaria Estadual de Turismo do Rio de Janeiro e Museu do Território. É uma concepção Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Obrigada e boa mesa. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
A história da barraca veio através do meu pai, né? Trabalhou muito aqui, 18 anos, com esse mesmo ponto. Tem uma parceria com todos os produtores rurais aqui, né, de Paraty. Alguns até trazem no momento, como estou sem carro, alguns trazem aqui para mim. É tudo orgânico, graças a Deus, né? Uma parceria que a gente fizemos aí. Olha, devido ao público que a gente alcançamos, eu prefiro trabalhar assim. É mais prazeroso, a pessoa tem mais liberdade, né? Tanto o local para parar, né? O carinho, a atenção que a gente tem dos clientes, né? E o nosso também para o cliente. Então eu acho melhor, assim, mais prazeroso estar na rua. Quando eu atraso, que também já fico preocupado se eu vou abrir, se não vou abrir. Então eles sentem falta. Realmente é impressionante. Já faz parte da rua.
Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Bom dia, Paraty. Ontem a gente teve um primeiro dia de programação que foi belíssimo, porque quando a gente pensa curadoria, a gente tem algumas ideias, mas a gente não sabe quando vai funcionar tão lindamente quanto funcionou ontem, assim. As mesas todas estavam interligadas, foi uma teia de conversas, foi muito bonito. Então, estamos muito animados nesse segundo dia. Eu acho que a essa altura todo mundo já deve saber que o cacique Raoni não vai poder vir, que foi uma grande tristeza para a gente, mas também estamos felizes e aliviados que ele está bem, já está em casa, só os médicos acharam melhor ele não fazer essa viagem, que ia ser um pouco sacrificante.
It would be too difficult. We're going to keep the roundtable with Chai Surui, who has a lot to say. She's an indigenous leader here, of the most important indigenous leaders in Brazil and the world, so the roundtable is going to be very productive nevertheless, even though Chief Raoni won't be here. Today we have Felipe Neto and Patricia Campos Mello. There's a beautiful roundtable on Brazil's history narrated by literary invention, and we have the Palestine writer Atef Abu Saif, who's going to be talking with Julia Dantas about the destruction of the Palestinian cities. And we can have a beautiful experience, which is to hear a podcast live and Radio Novello. So we're excited about that. We're going to begin the day. It's going to be a long day, but I would like to remind everyone to check the program and flip the Casa da Cultura, and to remind you that this year we have a space on the other side of the bridge, which is an extension of this town square, the Mother Church Town Square, where all the independent authors, with a lot of things to talk about. So check it out on the other side of the river to head this conversation with two authors who do beautiful literature, Lisa Ginzburg and Ana Maria Carvalho. Ana Margarida Carvalho, one of the union moderators is Adriana Silva, who's a columnist at Nexo, a frequent collaborator of 451, and one of the most important voices to talk about contemporary literature. Adriana. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, one and all, everybody who came to attend this morning. I want to call forward Ana Margarida de Carvalho and Lisa Ginzburg. I mentioned to them in the backstage, in addition to incredible books, they have the books with the best titles in Flip. I doubt that you will find better titles with such exciting titles and instigating titles. Ana Margarida de Carvalho is Portuguese. She was born and raised in Lisbon, where she worked for 25 years as a journalist. She debuted in literature with her novel, What Does the Sea's Fury Matter, in 2013, and won the Portuguese Writers Award, which is the top award in Portugal. Not content with that, or not satisfied, her other book, the following book, which was launched here in Brazil, You Can't Live in a Cat's Eyes, also won the same award, the Portuguese Writers Award. Ana is also the author of story anthologies and children's books. The gesture that we do to protect our heads by Dublinense, the Dublinense publishing house. Lisa, a book that takes place, a novel that takes place in Brazil. Lisa did a change in her career, a career change when she wrote her first novel, Dear Peace. It was a finalist in the Strega Prize, which is the most important prize in Italy. And her latest novel, Hidden Feather, is published here in the Nós publishing house. So let's have a round of applause for the two authors. We're going to open up with Lisa reading an excerpt from A Hidden Feather.
Os meses passam, muitos meses. Chega outro
Many
verão, depois mais
months go by, another summer
verão de
comes. The summer
2010.
in 2010,
Estão num buraco,
I'm in a
Rosa e
hole,
Tan,
Rosa and
numa
Tan,
noite quente,
and a hot
sem lua.
night with
No
no
céu,
moon
um
in
enxame de
the
estrelas,
sky,
até mesmo a Via Láctea é visível.
stars.
Longo rastro branco se
And
expandindo.
it's expanded, the white face,
A esse espetáculo
watching this
juntos,
spectacle
deitados
together,
juntos,
lying together,
no
Tan
fundo do
and
poço,
Rosa in the bottom of the
amontoados
well,
naquele buraco na terra,
cuddled in that
que Tan
that
regularmente
hole
cava a
in the
plaina com sua
land
pá.
with the shovel.
Constante, preciso, ele que de
The
resto
next,
não se dedica a mais
is no
nada com o
longer
mesmo
dedicated to
fervor.
anything with the same fervor.
Essa noite teve
This
o cuidado
evening,
de
they
trazer
had the care
pano para
of
colocar
bringing
no
a
chão.
cloth to spread on the
Lençol
ground,
velho e
an old
desbotado,
bread
retirado de algum
sheet
armário no casarão.
faded from the
Os
old
dois estão
colonial house, and they're
deitados nele.
both lying on this bed sheet on the ground. He says,
Quebrando o silêncio.
breaking the silence.
Estão tão próximos
We're
que
so
Rosa
close that
sente o
Rosa
sussurro de
feels
Tan sobre
Tan's
si.
whispering on herself.
Leve sopro em sua pele.
This
Que
breeze on
maravilha,
her
hein,
skin, that's
Rosa?
wonderful,
Sim,
Rosa.
é de fato
It's
uma
actually
noite
a
especial.
special
É
night.
comum observar
It's,
belas estrelas
and
na Curitiana,
watching
mas
skies,
esse é
but
especial.
night is special.
Pequena ou grande,
Star watching.
cada estrela
Each
cintila.
star
A constelação da Ursa
sparkles
Maior é tão
in the
clara
Ursa Major.
que dá
It's so
para
clear
se pensar que ela
that
está
bright that you
observando por
can
meio de
think that
telescópio.
the Ursa Major is, you
Temendo
can
que
see it without a
falar
telescope,
interrompa o
fearing
encantamento,
interrupting
Rosa
the
fica em
enchantment.
silêncio,
Rosa remains in
enquanto
silence.
instintivamente faz
Well,
gesto
instinctively,
com a
she makes a
mão,
gesture with her
gesto
hand,
tímido,
a timid
mas
gesture,
repentino e
but
preciso.
sudden and precise.
Estica os dedos,
She stretches
abre a
her
mão,
fingers, opens her
e ao
hand,
abri-la,
and
coloca
she
a palma na barriga
pushes
de
her
Tan,
palm
logo
on
assim
Tan's
com brilho.
belly, close
A
to the
mão
navel.
fechada,
Her
como
hand is
uma
closed
concha.
like a
O que
shell,
lhe passou
a
pela
seashell.
cabeça?
What
De
went
onde
through her
veio a
head?
ideia
Where did the
para esse
idea come
gesto?
for this gesture?
Rosa não
Rosa
sabe,
doesn't know,
nem se pergunta.
doesn't even
Isso
ask
não
herself.
importa,
This doesn't
não
matter,
agora.
not now. Just reminding everyone that you, both here in the auditorium and out on the town square, you can ask questions, write them on the slips of paper, and they'll come to me. In an interview that I read by Ana Margarida Carvalho, she said a phrase that was the following phrase: writer transgress, they subvert, they shuffle everything. Good writers invent a new voice. The genius writers a new language. I think in a certain sense, this fits to your careers, your writing, because you not only have invented new voices, and you've also invented, and this applies, you're dedicated to inventing new language, both to describe feelings, deep feelings in the characters, like Lisa does, and also to subvert the rules of writing and to tell stories, amazing stories like Anna. I would like to hear from you. What kind of voice is that you pursue in your respective novels? So thank you very much for your question. I want to, first of all, thank Flip for the invitation, the Camões Institute for sponsoring, and Dublinense in my publishing house, and obviously Flip and curator Ana Lima. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. I hope that you can understand. I have a Lisbon accent, so I hope you can understand me. But I love being in Brazil. I love this kind of swaying way of walking on the cobblestones. People are so lovely, even with rain. Even the dogs are friendly with us. I love it every time I come here. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. And I want to thank you all for the opportunity. I want to thank also my colleagues here in the round table. With regard to this, in other words, for me, the story of a book is as important as the form. The form, the writing is form. It's not only not just my work material, it's the matter. It's also matter. That's why I attempt to adjust the form to the story that I'm writing. If I write a book like this one here, which is the one that she said, it's a book with few passages, and I use a little bit of this graphic format to concentrate the text. Sometimes I make pauses, and sometimes I dilate and to subvert somewhat the logic of the syntax that we've learned at school. And obviously, we have to know the canons to be able to contradict them. Writing a novel has so many things. It's so difficult. It's necessary to have a good question for us to answer, to be able to answer. And the answers is in the unfolding of the story. You have to write it in a way that the language is favored. And also, you need something very difficult, which it's necessary to have your own voice, of course, as Adriana quoted, but it's necessary also to have charm. Without charm, it's a book with no charm. It doesn't have any impact on readers. Like as a politician or a singer, it's difficult to define, to be able to achieve that, to have charm, but it's difficult in a novel. Just to conclude, the other day I was discussing with a colleague, a writer, what is more difficult, to write a novel or to build a bridge? And I thought to myself, building a bridge is so difficult with the pillars and the columns and all the beams. He said, I think that a novel is even more difficult than building a bridge. He's an engineer. As Thomas Mann said, for a writer to write, it's very difficult. It's so difficult. It doesn't have this occupation of professor as a writer. That's the way I like to dedicate myself to my own writing. Lisa.
Sono davvero molto felice.
I'm really happy, deeply happy to be here. I truly admire Flip. I had heard a lot about it already. It's wonderful to be here now. I want to thank Anna Lima Cecilio Flip, the Italian Cultural Institute, and the NOS Publishing House, which translated and publishes my work with my translator, Francesca Cricelli. For me, it's a double path, a dual path, because I have a kind of obsession for words and language. There are phrases that come to me with a poetic rhythm, but the words permeate and traverse my mind and cross my mind, while the characters begin to arrive in my mind or come to my mind. So it's like two interferences that happen. The language is an obsession for me. And as a reader, it's what I observe when I read a book, when I read a novel. The first thing that I observe is the language. I understand if it's a language that echoes inside me, and my own language has to echo inside myself. But at the same time, I think that we're going to have an occasion to talk about this, but at a time when fiction and plot have been easy and difficult at the same time, I still believe heavily in the force of literature with the language. And I believe that the voice of each writer is what makes it so important, what makes literature so important. And since we're here in an international literary festival that was so well conceived, designed, and conducted, I think of the language as a Tower of Babel, and even a singer has to have his or her own voice, different voices that can engage in dialogue with each other. There's different voices which can engage in dialogue with each other. Let's move on talking about now precisely writing. I was talking with Lisa before in the backstage, and she talked about something that's cool is this. I talked about the titles of your books, and the titles of the books at some stage are unveiled, the meanings of the titles of the books in the middle of the story, right? In a certain sense, those of Anna as well. Afterwards, we can go into details on how to protect the gesture to protect your head. But I would like for you to talk a little bit about this moment when the title comes to you. Is it I think each book should have a story, right? When does the title come to you? Because it's like magic. As a reader, I was truly moved when suddenly I understood in the middle of the story why the book had that title. Would you like to begin, Anna? Okay, great. I love titles. And for 25 years, I was a journalist for 25 years, so the title is important. It's like a headline. Curiously, I love producing a title at the beginning. In other words, I don't do this compared to... I love my children's books. I don't consider a book... There are people that talk like this, they're writers, and I respect it, but it's not my case. But it's like giving a name to a baby, giving them a personality. Even before they're born, we give them a name, we name them. It's like they exist when they have the name. And if I have a title I've already created, like a rain hat or an umbrella. So this helps. Normally, the titles of others. This one, the gesture we make to protect our heads, is a title. Bosca won an award with a poem on torture. It's called Torture, where she says, she talks after crossing all the frontiers or the borders, all we have left is our skin. It's the last border that we have, is our skin. This gesture, which is universal, that you do to protect our heads when there's something coming at us, or when we're nervous, or when there's something that is about to happen, and there's a threat in front of us. It's a universal gesture, but it's also somewhat strange because we have more vital organs inside that are not as protected. In our head, we always have our skull, but it's very human to have a gesture to protect your head. So I would like to continue now precisely on this book, because you not only used the title of the poem, but also you took excerpts from the poem and for the titles of the chapters, which is beautiful. It's a beautiful poem, and I love this. I love poetry, and I don't write poetry myself, but I love it, and I read it or consume it literally. Well, would you like me to read an excerpt? Yes, we can. Okay. So, just to frame this, this is a book about war. Before I wrote, long before the war, this horrible war that's happening in Europe, in Ukraine, that's happening in the Middle East, which is genocide and carnage. And it's one of the things that always tormented me, because I was a child in the 1980s. And hovering over us was the threat, we Europeans, was the threat of the Cold War. And when finally the war broke, when things seemed calm, several terrible wars broke out, where things were repeated, which shouldn't have been repeated. So I wrote this book in which people only talk about there's no shot, only the collateral damage. That's all the book talks about, is collateral damage, all the consequences for people. I'm not interested geo-military politics or the military leaders. I'm interested only in the common people. So one of the types of collateral harm, they're not weapons. They're symbolized by a hawk, which is a terrible bird of prey, and very bloodthirsty, and very precise in its prey. And we're talking about rape as a wartime weapon, which is perpetuated for generations. Wartime rape. All the daughters talking about refugees as well. And it's this part that I'm going to talk about different, that I'm going to read, which is a excerpt where the women are end up being the dominant figures in a community. It was a community that had to move to a place. It's not their own place. It's full of, it's windy where the women go crazy because they can't keep their hair tied up, so the hair, the wind blows so much, so the doors are banging and the roof tiles are blown off, and the chickens have to have their chicks stuck to their feet so they won't be blown away by the wind. So the women go to the well, and this is a wartime well, weapon rather, the control of the water, and they talk with each other in a kind of polyphony or symphony. They're all talking at the same time in this polyphonous conversation of the women around the well. Sorry, the introduction, but just to contextualize the excerpt. And we can go throw our lament to the wind. It takes us as foolish. We cannot put our feet in our water. We only, what do we get with this? A man to hear us, and it was not a man. It was nobody, not even more. We understand with God, without intermediaries, with middlemen. This without a priest doesn't give us, this church without a priest doesn't give us any protection. We're still, we were the one who were able to set aside, entertain, fight against the wind. For they think that we're foolish. If they think that we're foolish, what will the priest think that we're meeting at the well? And people say that there is, none of us should be fooled. They are tombs of our mouths, tombs, not real tombs, but as if they were minds. Don't laugh, because I know you. Maria Alzira, I think what this presses my heart. You don't remember the torrent of the mud that covered our cemetery when the river overflowed in the cemetery and mines. Saints until bones, tibias, and jaw bones with the teeth that were floating in the flood. It's terrible against living people. My entire life, but to attempt to fight against death, you need to have the devil on your side. What about the house of the Lord? In the writing, if this well is closed, how can we get water? And to see radiating in the milk legs still with the flesh on them, because I was waiting, and we still have another world. There's a little chick fainted with a stain on its head, and the dead cannot defend themselves. The dead cannot die. Don't be fooled. What they have done was to kill our dead and to leave them unburied, to be devoured by the animals in plain view. And the little body of her baby, it was still washed in the mud. Poor thing. Bless God. And a boot with the foot still inside. It was not the same person. And like a devil, overnight, because they killed her daughter, and they killed her alive. But judge them. Help me to say what I was saying. The land is something that you cannot give up, or you can't let people steal it without leaving blood to fertilize the seeds. Lisa, the titles, talk about them. It's always very interesting, this issue of the titles. In my own case, for both novels that were translated into Portuguese, both Carapaz and A Hidden Feather, the two titles came late to me in my work phase of the book. I had already written at least 2/3 of the book, and suddenly the phrase came to mind. I wrote it, and it was like an intuition that I had, an insight. I said, this will be the title. But before that, I wish to say that it's interesting how we writers save the files of our novels in the computer. In my own case, it changed so often in both books, the name of the file. I changed the name of the file, so it's worked, at least in my own case. but I talked with other friends, writer friends who had this experience as well. So it's a kind of work in progress, the work of the title. The title changes. It's rare, or at least with me, it's never happened that I had chosen it ahead of time. It comes to me at some stage, and it's interesting how many files I saved with different names. In the case of Carapaz, it's a play on words, which unfortunately in Portuguese isn't perfect. You can't translate it, Carapaz, but the idea is a carapace, like a tortoise's shell, that the carapace and carapaz, like an invocation for peace, dear peace. So it's a play on words, it's a pun. In writing, I looked at the word, that word carapace. I realized that it would become dear peace, carapaz, a story of protection, but also how protection involves the desire to go beyond and to make peace with the past. So in the case of the hidden feather, pluma escondida, that kind of phrase which comes to you, comes suddenly out of nowhere with its musicality. So there was this care with the hidden feather in the past, a hidden feather, the memory acts as a hidden feather when it begins to float in the air. So I loved this phrase, a phrase that I wrote myself, but I realized that this was the title. So these are moments of great joy, late joy that comes late, doesn't come to you immediately. Lisa, if the novel is to know what the characters think, the characters, what they feel, I think in yours, we truly delve very deep into these characters, especially. How is your relationship with your characters? Do they show you the way? Do they change the directions of the novel, the book? Yes, very much so. I love using the metaphor of a person who travels with their suitcase carrying puppets, because they're like figures that accompany me. When a book ends, I continue in dialogue with Nina, Madalena, and Carapaz, with Rosa, and Hidden Feather. And for me, they're like people. And the time comes in the dark, at the beginning, the characters, they come out of nowhere. It's amazing. I don't know if Anna agrees with me that they come out of nowhere, in kind of a magical way. They come in out of the dark, and they gain light and shapes, and they begin to relate to each other, afterwards with me. So it's listening. It involves listening. I increasingly believe that our task has to be very humble in listening to what the characters have to say, because the characters, have a lot to say, and we have to be alert and to accompany them. So I think that they're the ones who accompany me. They guide me, and it's important how they continue alive with me and how they grow. It's like a suitcase of the puppeteer who travels with his puppets in a suitcase. Anna, you in turn have absolutely fantastic characters, detestable and adorable at the same time, especially you cannot live in a cat's eyes, but also in the gesture that we make to protect our heads. You love and hate the characters a lot. And it's like there's a feeling that you have fun and you're entertained by creating these people. They're so unique and unusual, unprecedented. What's this invention all about, of these characters? I was thinking to what Lisa was saying to us, and I remember a phrase by Jorge Amado. He's ours, Portuguese, the Portuguese people. He's ours, the Portuguese, for the Portuguese people, but the Portuguese people has an unrequited love relationship with Brazil. Your literature and music, it's an unrequited love story between Portugal and Brazil. Lógico, Amado, I'd like to kill my characters, but they don't want to die. I realize this sometimes. I would like for this character not to be so incisive in the novel, and they gain proportions, and I pity having to not be a main character. I wish they could have been main characters, not just secondary characters. I like this ambiguity. I think at the end of the day, there's a poet, a Portuguese poet, a beautiful Portuguese poet. She writes beautiful things. She's already died, but she said everything that's beautiful has a monster suspended in it. And I believe that this is kind of the ambiguity. There's a good side, but there's also always a kind of dark side. So I like to play with this ambiguity. And I love to play with the most difficult thing to be able to do, which is this issue of the art of attempting to say things without saying them. Okay. Another author which played with this was Machado de Assis. He played with the creating characters, Capitu, not describing her, but just saying her gypsy's eyes, the oblique gypsy's eyes. This is Capitu, and we have the idea of Capitu is without other description. This is in Machado de Assis, and I love this. I love leaving this space vague for the reader to have their own impressions and to create over the course of the narrative some traps and direct the reader, to these traps, because it's one of my themes. Nothing is what it seems to be. So sometimes readers can be surprised because they think that the character is like X and there turns out to be Y or Z. Everybody has a front side and a back side, and an outside and an inside, rather. And there's a characteristic in their books that the characters and the stories, they take turns, backs and forth and meanders, but we aren't able to disconnect from them. What is the secret to lead the reader and to keep the reader attached, the secret attached to the reading? The reader goes, they continue. I don't care if they're somewhat angry and exasperated. I'm a person who loves to create this disorientation, these labyrinths, these mazes, this confusion, because I believe that the reader follows me. If they don't follow me, doesn't matter. But if they accompany me in the reading, there be some satisfaction when they are re-encountered. Okay, that's where I am. Okay, I find the way. I'm a person of chaos. I'm not a person of symmetry. I like disorientation and chaos because I believe that chaos is the order that needs to be deciphered. So when a reader grabs these loose tips, it may give them some satisfaction and irritation as well, and annoyment. I apologize if you have that kind of feeling with reading my work. That wasn't my intention, but I wanted to have gratification of re-encountering after finding themselves again after having been lost in the reading. Lisa, you in turn, in addition to having a very poetic verse, you transform as well the places into characters. So the cities, the towns, I was able to envisage quite well this little place that you invented near Florence, the spaces. I would like for you to talk a little bit about especially the towns and cities, because Carapace has Rome and Paris as characters as well, right, in the book. And here, Florence, in this place that you created, close nearby, close to Florence. Yes. The places are like characters for me. The places are love. And I was thinking this, coming back to Rio de Janeiro, after so many years, I felt a very deep emotion, as if I was finding an old love. I had a I have a close relationship to geography. I have a person who has lived in several different places myself, and I have felt at home in different places. I have roots, diasporic roots because of my family history, but in general, I tend to develop with places very impassioned relations. So my fantasy tends to invent places, and as was the case here, that for me, that place became a place as well. Every day, it was like as if I were going to go to Cochetana, the place that I invented. It was a shift, a special shift in transition. The fact that the characters are in different places means that their affective relations, which sometimes are family relations, other times are amorous, their affective relations, one way or the other, not helped by distance. It's something that I've always have thought very impassionate. The geographic distance, to the extent to which it may or may not help relations, personal relations. It's an important theme, and I'm talking about it in the land of saudade in Brazil, or yearning, but the saudade that we can feel for others when we haven't seen them for a long time. It's something which can affect the relationships or break off a relationship. I created 2 different novels where in both novels there's this issue of distance, something which glues and consolidates, but also pushes away. There's the problem of having to go home. In Carapaz, Madalena, the oldest sister, has to go back to Rome. She has this imperative of returning to Rome to revisit the past. In this novel, the first phrase, going back to the phrases that reach us, the first phrase was precisely the very beginning. I decided that I have to go back to Rome. In the case of the hidden feather, there's an adoptive child coming from Moldavia and feels that he has to go back to Moldava. He has to go back to his original country. So these trajectories work for me, not in this geographic sense, but they're like fuel for the sentimental dynamics. The character felt that he had to go back to Moldava. Liz, in the opening, Luis Antonio Simas talked about João do Rio, and he said that for João do Rio, he wanted to tell stories for people that were on the fringes or outcasts, and for the upper classes, the elite as well. These would be the characters who had stories to tell, interesting stories to be told, and awakened interesting stories in him. You tell stories of middle-class people, and you make these lives that could have been mediocre into incredible stories. What's the secret of this gaze from the point of view of the mediocre, banal, or mundane? In Italy, people talk a lot, and they say that the middle class no longer exists. Meanwhile, it's true that I tell stories where in certain cases there's the social privilege, in other cases not, but where the important element is human. Human, which is cross-class, which becomes a form of transcending social class, especially in the hidden feather. In the more upper class, the feelings are more frozen, especially father and mother. That relationship is very difficult, but in the more humble classes, it's not there's a love, a special kind of love, but to be parents is more feasible in the lower classes, so there are no rules, of course. Perhaps it's an issue only of listening deeply and to consider human beings at their origins and their privileges, and also human beings, the human beings that they are. The stories from the heart are connected to wealth and poverty less than we think, because they're stories from the heart. So it's about being in sync with the heart. Ana, I read an interview of yours in Visão, which is the magazine where you worked for some time as a journalist, where you yourself ask the questions for yourself. And I borrowed a phrase, doesn't it seem daring to write a book in a continent which is not your own continent, which takes place there in a century that doesn't belong to in the 19th century, and addressing such a delicate theme as enslavement, as slavery, or religion, and we're talking here, you can not live in a cat's eyes. This self-interview, it's the same group. It was Jornal de Letras. It was a different magazine, actually, or journal. Since I was, my colleagues didn't want to give an interview, so they said, interview yourself, but self-interview. It appeared in small print, so people thought that I was somebody else. I was not elegant as an interviewer. I was interviewing myself, and it created some misconception. But how do you dare to ask such a stupid question? People asked me, and people didn't realize that I was the interviewer and the interviewee. Nobody realized, and oftentimes they said, okay, but you are rather nice. You sounded so aggressive as the interviewer. So people didn't really understand what it was all about, the self-interview, but the truth in this question. And that was the case. I write about things from the perspective of someone, characters in the 19th century, for example. And we can't live in the cat's eyes and address themes that are very delicate. In Portugal, it's not easy to talk about due to our past of slave traffic, which lasted 400 years, and 15 million people were traded in horrible conditions. And even after slavery was banned, it continued illegally, which didn't improve things for these people that had been kidnapped and stolen from their own homes. Especially came mostly to Brazil, so the theme is my own. It's also not mine at the same time. The century is not mine, the country is not mine. It's not my fault either. Sometimes when they say, okay, the Portuguese are the colonizers, I say, no, you are colonizers. You, white people, are the colonizers. You came, and I stayed back. I wasn't part of the slave trade. It's how I attempt to defend myself from this atrocious past of the Portuguese nation. Okay, that said, that's another topic. What was the other part of the question? In fact, yes, I like to touch the skin, and writing is always an exercise of otherness, to be able to put ourselves in other people's skin. So I attempt to do this exercise of putting myself in the other person's skin, of an enslaved person, or the skin of a rich 19th century woman who was absolutely prejudiced, and a slave-holding, and the slave, and the priest, and this range of characters, and the slave ship, which shipwrecked and ended up on the beach, and these people full of prejudices, social, religious prejudice, gender prejudices, all kinds of prejudice in the 19th century. They have to cooperate with each other until they all have the same skin tone and the same smell on the beach. And the changes in power relations are just something that's just interesting. The characters evolve. Okay, fine. But this is the story of the book. I'm not going to give a spoiler, but I'm not a person. I write, it's a conflict, it's an internal war. It kind of torments me in a sense. This inability to relate to others, to not perceive others. We don't perceive anything in others. That's a problem. It's terrible, but that's life, right? That's life. And the theme of conflict and that of war is that of literature, and has been since Homer, right? Both books have images, very powerful images. You mentioned in the excerpt that you read from a gesture that you make to protect your heads, the women, it's very visual when you describe women that are with disheveled hair and they have lead sinkers on the edges of their skirts to keep the wind from blowing off their skirts. The saint can't live in a cat's eyes, and that image of that saint, the statue with the hair of an indigenous woman, and nature as well. Nature and animals have an important role in the sea, the wind, the hawk. In a word, the whale, and you can't live in a cat's eyes. I would like for you to talk a little bit about, to understand how some minor obsessions, the sea appears in both books. I never thought about that saying where the wind takes a curve, because the city exactly this. It's true. Men are in conflict with themselves, but also with the elements. There's a community, and the gesture that takes place in this windy city. They can't raise crops, and you can't hear each other because it's so noisy. We've had some interference with the microphone. We can't hear the microphone now. We're suspending the translation momentarily because the sound system has presented a problem.
da vertigem. Tem um livro da Rosa Monteiro, na qual ela fala justamente ela fala sobre o processo de criação dela e de outros, ela investiga a criatividade, e ela fala justamente desse momento da vertigem, ou do assombro, ou do desdobramento, seja lá qual for a palavra que vocês quiserem usar, ou que as pessoas usam, que é o de você, no caso da Rosa, ela descreve que ela estava no trem, e de repente ela olhou pela janela e viu um prédio caindo aos pedaços, pensou, criou uma história ali, né, naquele momento. E aí ela coloca isso como, né, isso é o que diferencia, talvez, o romancista, o escritor. Como é que são esses momentos de deslumbramento? Como acontecem esses momentos com vocês? Pode começar. Eu acho que os escritores têm que ser pessoas. Alguns escritores não têm nada a dizer o que é que eles têm que ser ou não. Desculpem, não era a intenção. Mas os escritores devem estar primeiramente sobre o efeito do assombro, sobre o efeito da curiosidade, e devem deixar-se contaminar, às vezes até por pequenas coisas, como esse caso da Rosa Monteiro, não é? Devem, qualquer coisinha, quando nós estamos a escrever um romance, não sei se a Luísa sente o mesmo, qualquer, ficamos uma espécie de vampiros, assim, vamos sugando coisas que nos podem servir para o texto eu tenho muitos momentos desses, depois tenho que anotar, porque a minha memória, infelizmente, é muito porosa e vou esquecendo, às vezes escrevo, outras tentar escrever uma nota no computador, mas tenho momentos em que perco coisas que isto era bom e depois esqueço. Mas talvez o que mais me inspira é a frase anterior. A frase anterior inspira muito a seguinte. Portanto, a linguagem é muito inspiradora para mim, as palavras.
Just to announce that there's no translation into English now because the sound system is experiencing some problems.
I'm
still trying to discover things from my past, and I love writing words and retrieve words. Perhaps I am not that familiar with, as I should be, the reality of literature in Brazil and that of contemporary literature in Portugal is the same. But I follow your music closely, and which I think is my own also. I love Brazilian music. Like my father couldn't even watch soap operas on TV, Brazilian soap operas, and everybody talked about what was happening in the Brazilian soap opera. My father wouldn't let us watch them. This my father banned us from watching soap opera. We had to go to bed early as well. My upbringing was very strict, and it was rather strict. But this ban and prohibition didn't mean that failed to follow Brazilian literature. On the contrary, I couldn't watch Gabriela Clove and Cinnamon, the soap opera, but I read the book, Jorge Amado's book. It was like an explosion for me, a moment. My childhood, I wasn't interested in the adult world. I thought the adults were totally boring, and I was a child into my early adulthood, actually. I saw a concert by Chico Buarque. I was small. I remember watching his show, looking through the adults' legs, and I thought to myself, it was like an epiphany, and the joy of everybody watching Chico Buarque. I said, this is life. It was a child's thought, realizing beautiful life. Chico Buarque is all about life, right? Since you were in this and talking about Brazil, Lisa, you have two books which have been take place in Brazil, and you're a reader also of Brazilian authors. I would like for you to talk a little bit about these books which haven't been launched here. We're asking Nós to translate and publish your books and your relationship to literature as well, Brazilian literature specifically. I wrote a small book about Bahia. It's called Malia, Bahia. I wrote a novel which talks about Brazil. It's also somewhat reinvented with the plot which takes place in Brazil, but the places are somewhat invented again. And my encounter was with Clarice Lispector. I wrote a book with drawings published in Italy 2 years ago on Clarice Lispector. It's a biography of Clarice Lispector dedicated to adolescents, teenagers, but wonderful drawings and illustrations. The author called Pia Valentinis, an artist. I continue to think of Clarice. I would like to write more things about Clarice. I had love, and my Brazilian publisher, Simone Paulino, loves Clarice Lispector. Who's a writer who speaks to me. And it has to do with a lot of things. I think it's because all of you know quite well that Clarice was born in Ukraine. She came to Brazil at a very young age, but there's this theme of encounter with Brazil as a land which you can take roots in. That was how it was, in addition to my inner life, my personal life, making me live here in your wonderful country. It's true that I feel at home here in Brazil, but more than other countries where I've also lived. And I believe that Clarice Lispector found herself, and she felt so Brazilian. She wanted to be naturalized. She insisted on that. All of this speaks to me. That's my answer. My Brazilian literature is Clarice Lispector so far, but I love The Devil to Pay in the Backlands by Guimarães Rosa, or Grande Sertão Veredas, or The Devil to Pay in the Backlands. When we were talking before you, and I asked Lisa, what would you like to talk about? In Flip, she said, I would like to talk about love. And there's a person in the audience who sent in a question, why does Madalena fall into love so quickly in Carapaz? Why did she fall in love so quickly? Several readers have a surprise with this story at the end of the book. I believe that it's the break in the shell, the carapace. The carapace has to break when it's too tough. The person is very logical and self-controlled. Something has to happen, which is something that makes a break with them, with that. And my fantasy was that. But she fell in love. She has a relationship, like secret love relationship. We don't know, but it might have been very brief, like an amorous adventure, an affair in a trip. It might sound scandalous, but things happen very quickly, which are like enlightenments and insights, like Madalena has her own life. I think that's how it is. She gained her own life. This is the grand adventure. It was like a meeting with herself. She should have worked through her own past and her sister, Nina, as well. And sometimes to solve things and work through things, we have to do things. We have to be surprised by ourselves. That is a very important moment, I believe, in writing as well. You have to write things which surprise you self. You don't have, it has to be a plot where everything is fine and all worked out with a closed circle and everything is fine and dancing. Life is chaos as well. Life is full of surprises, positive and negative. And I saw her falling in love in that sense. In recent years, I think that all literary festivals have discussed in some way or another self-fiction. Until after the Nobel for Annie Ernaux, even more so, after the Nobel Prize for Annie Ernaux, why play with God and be a novelist? Anna. Yes, it's true that we are I don't do self-fiction. I don't write self-fiction. I'm not interested at all in it. And I like more to take a distance, but to be there. We can't escape ourselves, obviously, but I like to write about what torments me, and it ends up being somewhat myself, right? But torment is universal, the inequalities, the conflicts, war, and everything that I talked about before. But we are actually a little, ever since we can create, kill, join, combine. And I remember I wrote some children's books, and the children ask very pure and naive questions, very innocent questions, not domesticated by people like adults are. And I did a little children's story, which is Noah's Ark, where Noah, rather than saving the animals, saved the vegetables. It was a story for children. And I said precisely what the Annie Ernaux, we are kind of God. We can do everything. So a little girl asked me, very small, raised her finger and said, "But are you a kind of God? Why does God have to be a man and didn't make Noah as a woman?" I was taken by surprise. Why did it have a woman rather than Noah? Since Noah was saving the vegetables, and it was like a 5-year-old girl caught me by surprise, and I was cornered by her. Lisa, I believe in the force of fantasy. I've already said several times today, and I believe that in this difficult world, at this harsh time, that we're so worried about the future, but at the same time, we're trying to control everything. We have cell phones, and we control minute by minute everything. We need, as writers, but as human beings as well, to let things flow, go with the flow, and with our imagination. Imagination has to be more at ease. Rilke, the poet, the grand poet, Vilke. But when there's no memory in a time, these times are not creative, but we can say the same things. A time which has no imagination is not creative. We need a lot of fantasy. Fantasy helps to confront reality better. I have a maximum admiration for some authors who have wrote self-fiction books. I believe that it's a literary genre that's extremely interesting, but sincerely, I think that in recent years, it's a trend. We have a lot of autobiographical plots. This steals a little bit of the room for imagination. I think we need a lot of fantasy, to fantasize. The name of our chat here is Peace and Gesture, which I believe that involves literature, your writing. What are the gestures and the moments of peace that you seek in literature? Sometimes to say that my books are somewhat dark and somber, you used an expression. Some of them are detestable, right? Even. But I think that there's always a good side. And I think that even the most terrible sensations, there are beautiful things in those terrible sensations. And so when they say these terrible situations, but those characters, but there's a beautiful moment and they meet each other, even in terrible situations. But what was the question about after all? I forgot. That wasn't what you were asking. What about gestures of peace in your writing? There are gestures, detestable gestures, more detestable gestures than peaceful ones. That's true in my writing. But after all, I talk about horrible things to be able to, for the reader to think, okay, it's good that that's fiction and not reality. All the better. But in the middle of this terrible carnage, I wrote another book which hasn't been published here. It's called 10 War Stories, the French invasions in Portugal, the Second World War. 10 war stories, terrible situations, the Nazis, and suddenly I see very similar situation in concentration camps and everything, very similar to what happened. There are currently violating in all the conventions. It seems like we haven't learned anything from the past. This is a cliche, I know, but in fact, we repeat the same mistakes. Our evil and nothing, apparently nothing. We've learned nothing. It's kind of terrible. I'm tormented by this. Children are dying in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. Little children, we still talk about what the Hezbollah did to Israel, but they've just been born, and they've been living in the middle of a war with no water, with hygiene, no food, in tents, and they're dying and ready to die in Gaza Strip. It's terrible, and it's even difficult for me to talk about, but in fact, the literature to talk about things that are happening in reality. In your books, Peace and Gestures have gained an absolutely different dimension, right? To answer your question, I believe as a writer, but also as a person, the gesture of peace now is communication. We have to work to seek a kind of communication that's less neurotic, with words that are born from silence and reflection and calm and nature, and calm that nature can give us. And I believe that, I think it's good to think about that peace, the gesture of peace is to communicate well, which also means to write well, to read well, but to think of the way of communicating. Thank you very much, Ana. Thank you very much, Lisa. Thank you all indeed. Ana Cecília, thank you, Mauro. Thank you, everyone, one and all.